Good morning, everybody. Happy August. Nice to see you all. Welcome to this month's Connect OC Coalition meeting. Excited to have you all. As usual, we'll give it a couple of minutes before we start up, just to give folks some time to join, and then we'll get rolling. For now, while we have you, we welcome you to take the opportunity to introduce yourself in the chat, share who you are, what brings you to the meeting. If you'd like folks to be able to contact you outside of the meeting, feel free to include your contact information. And like I said, we'll get started in just a couple of minutes here. All right, once again, good morning to everyone. Welcome to those who are just joining in. So you're in the August 2023 Connect OC Coalition meeting, just in case you were looking for something else. Good to have you all with us once again. For those of you who are not familiar, Connect OC is a community coalition funded through the Orange County Healthcare Agency and the Mental Health Services Act. We focus on transitional age use mental health here in Orange County. Our focus is really promoting the existing resources here in the community. One of the things that for many of you, you may recognize that can be a challenge for young adults seeking mental health help is just not knowing what's out there. So that's our focus, is helping better promote what exists here in the county, the wealth of resources we do have. For those of you who have been keeping up the last couple of months, we've been doing a summer series on anxiety. And we had the idea for August to cover the subject of intrusive thoughts. It's a subject that in our conversations with folks out in the community, where folks have explained, especially providers, have described what seems like an increase in young adults coming to seek services for issues related to intrusive thoughts or obsessive compulsive disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder like symptoms. And so we thought it would be a valuable topic to cover. It's certainly associated with anxiety, can be a source of anxiety, and not something I think we talk about quite a bit, and something that, as we'll see in our presentation today, can be pretty well misunderstood. And so we're looking forward to spending some time exploring that. And I'm very excited then to introduce to you all our speaker for today, Matt Codde, who is a licensed clinical social worker and the founder of Restored Minds, who focuses specifically on this subject. He's got a wealth of ways that you can interact with the work he's doing, including a podcast, his website, but he also works as a clinician, and I'll leave the rest to him to describe the many, many other things that he's doing and to introduce his presentation. I think you all really enjoy it. Matt, I'll pass it off to you.
Oh, thank you, David. I appreciate the introduction. So hey, well, thank you everyone for having me today. I'm very excited to be able to share and speak on this topic for a bit, because yeah, it's something that I as I'll share, have personal experience with, and am very passionate about, because it's something that is definitely something someone can overcome and get better from. And so with all that said, to give you a little bit about who I am, I'll tell you in a second, but I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've worked in kind of a broad spectrum of the field. Before I started Restored Minds, I was a senior social worker with Orange County for 2 years, an intern 2 years. as a senior social worker, and then worked in drug residential treatment, worked in intensive outpatient treatment for OCD and anxiety, running intensives, worked in the nonprofit at CYS, and then have run private practice. And so I kind of have a little bit of a feel of all the different aspects. Not by any means an expert, but just how the challenges that each particular level gets presented with. So with that said, my goal today is to, as I was creating this presentation, I was really trying to make sure you guys leave with an understanding of intrusive thoughts, OCD, and anxiety, at least from how I perceive it and how I work at it, and when I work with people, how I kind of go about it. But I also want you to be able to take away analogies and things that I use to, if you're going to be the person who's intervening with someone, if you personally experience it with it, to understand these kind of four main points that I'm going to cover today, because I think most likely you guys are going to be presented, a lot of you are going to be presented with people in the midst of like a crisis, and being able to kind of walk them through these 4 points even will help them experience great relief and understanding. So that's my objective today. And then I'm also going to give some follow-up resources as well for free to people attending and people watching the replay. So with that said, are you cool if I share my screen? Yep. Cool. Okay. Guess I need to share it first, huh? All right. You guys green light, you got my slide deck? Cool. All right. Okay, so yeah, this presentation is going to be about OCD, anxiety, and intrusive thoughts, and kind of how everything ties together. We're going to talk about diagnosis, treatment, and common keys to success on the path to healing. So let's talk about some, and my goal is to kind of go through this first part pretty quick. And my hope is to be able to answer some Q&A at the end. And so we have a time slot for that. So I want to make sure that I get the chance to answer questions if there are any. And if you have questions as we go, feel free to post them in the chat. And then we can circle back to them at the end, just so I can kind of keep the flow. So let's talk about some common definitions, right? So we have stress. That's essentially our body's response to a challenge or demand, right? And this is, what we would call the sympathetic nervous system, or the fight or flight, that gets activated. A stressor is anything that triggers the stress response, right? And this can be physical, psychosocial, psychological. And the types of stress that we can experience are physical danger, right? Like someone driving a car at us, right? Like that's an example of acute physical danger. Long-term physical challenges. So that would be something like, you're in chronic pain, you're stranded on an island, right? You're in a survival situation that will put your body in the stress response. And then finally, psychological and social stress. Now, this is really what we're going to focus on. And this is really kind of what's going to encompass anxiety, because what's happening is with psychological stress, the mind is producing a thought or a scenario, and the body is literally responding to that as a threat, even though there's no immediate danger, right? So when we're talking about intrusive thoughts, this is essentially what's happening is this psychological stress kind of phenomenon that's very unique to humans. And so obviously a danger is an observable immediate threat. Anxiety is a futuristic or past threat. So like I said, I'm a clinical social worker. I'm the founder of Restored Minds. I run the OCD and Anxiety podcast. And then, really my specialty right now is helping people break out of the OCD and anxiety loop and take back control of their life. And so we have an online program for people with Restored Minds, and a lot of various workshops, resources, and we really try to make it accessible in digital format. So a little bit about my story here. When I was 18, I had just started college, and I was just in a kind of a downstate. I was going to Santiago Community College, or Rancho Santiago, and basically I just didn't have any idea what I wanted to do with my life. Just had a first big breakup, and I just had a lot of just stress going on. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I started getting, just like in class, I remember the day, I just started getting flooded with intrusive thoughts, and I didn't know what I was experiencing. And it caused a great deal of distress. And so, I'm going to talk about all the things I did wrong in the hopes that it will prevent other people from going down that path. But, long story short, that time of my life led me into, this OCD and anxiety loop. And what happened as a result of being in high states of stress, as with most people with, that are in high states of stress, is you become depressed because your system begins to move into, red, as we'll talk about. But, this led into multiple years of struggling. And so what ended up happening is eventually I had seen, I had gone to the therapist at the college. I had gone to several different therapists in the community. I was looking for help. No one could really speak into my experience. No one really understood how to help me. Got all these different labels thrown at me, like, I think you have anxiety, to, this could be like the onset of bipolar and all this other stuff. Right. And I knew it wasn't right because I knew what I was experiencing. And it wasn't until like, what ended up happening was, one of my big fears at that time was this idea of like, well, what if I get possessed one day? Right. And I think I'd seen some like movie, and that like fear just locked on. Right. And as I was looping, I used to go to a church and like have people pray with me about it. Right. Like, that was one of my compulsions, as I'll talk about. And the woman, who was there, like, God bless her, but she looked at me and was like, "Hey, I think you have OCD." And I was like, "Well, I don't wash my hands. Like, that's silly, right?" And I know it's like, because that's what I understood about OCD at the time. Long story short is that led me on the path of really beginning to understand OCD, seek help, and begin to understand what OCD was, this loop, as I'm going to talk about, and then more importantly, how to get better from it. So a little bit about my background, and then, ultimately became a therapist, and kind of went on that journey with the career until here we are now. When you're in this loop, there's four main components, and this really exists, in my opinion, in any element of anxiety, right? And so we have, with anxiety, like I said, it's the mind creating an idea, and this can be a past or future based intrusive thought. It creates an uncomfortable feeling, generally fear, could be guilt, shame. The person does a safety behavior, as you're going to see at the bottom here, or what some people call compulsions, right? That creates a feeling of short-term relief that then reinforces the thought. And then this person gets caught in this loop, and this loop creates chaos. So when I talk about like OCD and anxiety, and we'll talk about this more, it's not that the intrusive thoughts or anxiety is a disorder, but this loop, when you have all these components together, creates disorder in the person's life. And that's kind of why our objective is how to break the loop, right? And so in this presentation, my goal is to kind of go through 4 shifts of working at this loop to help people break it. And the central point of what I teach and when I work with someone comes back down to this: is how you understand a problem will determine how you try to solve it, and how you try to solve it will determine the actions you take, and the actions you take will determine your results. And so if we're doing things that are not producing results, a lot of times it's not about trying those things harder. What it's about is recontextualizing the entire problem, right? And this is why when we look at this problem, not from an intrusive thought standpoint or an anxiety standpoint, but from a loop standpoint, we're able to have much more success in helping the person get relief. Because I'm sure any of you that are clinicians, any of you that experience intrusive thoughts, know that the harder and harder you try to stop intrusive thoughts, then it seems to make them worse. That's the paradox of them, right? This is what Daniel Wegner wrote about in his book, White Bears and Other Unwanted Thoughts, in the 80s, where they did experiments of telling people like, hey, don't think of white bears. And, if I told you all not to think of a white bear right now, like, what's the exact thing that's going to pop in your head, right? A white bear, right? And the same thing goes on with intrusive thoughts in that way. And that's an example of what we would call a mental compulsion, which I'll dive into in a little bit. So first thing, someone comes to you, or someone's experiencing this idea of intrusive thoughts that are bombarding their mind, right? And the number one thing we don't want to do is stop trying to change the thoughts themselves, right? And so this is if we're trying to work on the loop from here at the top. We're saying, hey, we need to try to, so I've seen all sorts of interventions tried where people are like, oh, When you have a bad thought, snap a rubber band on your, hand, replace it with a good one, pray about it, this and that, right? The thing is if we're working at it from a thought perspective, we're going to lose 100% of the time, right? Never seen this be effective. And so there's the thought, and then there's the content of the thought. So the content of the thought is really what the person's afraid about. For example, if I had the thought, what if I get possessed? That's the thought. If we're working at it from like a possession issue, right, and trying to talk about possession, now we're working at it from the content of the thought, which is even worse. Okay. And because it just leads to more and more what if questions, more and more doubt, and you'll never be able to talk someone out of this. Right. And this is why like traditional therapeutic interventions like talk therapy are ineffective, right? When it comes to this loop. So some common themes or subtypes or thoughts that people are going to have are things as follows: fears about contamination, fears about having anxiety or having a panic attack, fears about health, fears about specific bodily sensations, social situations, relationships and loved ones. The intrusive thoughts are generally going to fall into three main categories, and they're going to be intrusive, unwanted, harmful thoughts, intrusive, unwanted, sexual thoughts, and intrusive, unwanted, blasphemous thoughts. So to give some specific examples, and again, this is going to be kind of PG-13 R-rated content here for a second, but that's okay because I want to talk specifics. So the intrusive, harmful thoughts would be something to the effect of, what if I lose control and hurt someone? What if I lose control and stab someone? What if I lose control and commit suicide, right? Like, so it could be harm towards others. It could be harm towards loved ones, harms towards self. And this fear of what if this happens is really what we're kind of looking for with those intrusive thoughts. The intrusive sexual thoughts could be intrusive sexual thoughts about, towards family members, towards loved ones, towards random people. It could be intrusive thoughts of like, what if, and then questioning one's sexuality. So I've seen it go both ways in the sense of what if a heterosexual person's like, what if I'm gay? And then people, a person that might be homosexual might be like, well, what if I'm actually straight? Right. And I've seen that both ways on that one. And then intrusive, unwanted, blasphemous thoughts are thoughts towards God. It might be like, what if it could be sexual thoughts about God. I mean, there's so many ways that this can manifest, right? But the worrying about existential ideas, worrying about going to heaven and hell, worrying about committing the unforgivable sin, things like that. And then even existential ideas of like the meaning of life. But the point is that you can go into phobias as well as elevators, spiders, orderliness, perfection, and driving and flying. I don't really want to get too lost in the weeds here because this can take on so many different forms. And what will generally happen is as soon as one person kind of gets cool with one topic, it bounces to another, which is why we need to really make sure that we work at it from a loop perspective, because that's going to produce the best long-term results. So the first thing that we want to do is really help the person understand this idea of consciousness, because what the underlying belief that's causing so much anxiety is this idea that I am this voice in my mind, or I am my thoughts, right? In this over-identification with the mind. And so first thing that I'll generally talk about and teach people on is this idea of consciousness. And so what is that is really your experience, right? You are the experiencer. And I mean, I could dive into a lot of, cool work right now, but I'm going to keep it pretty surface. So the basic premise is this idea that you hear this voice in your mind, and this voice in your mind is saying things that you don't like, right? And the way that we start to differentiate the person from the voice in the mind themselves is this idea of like asking them basic questions where they're like, well, I'm having intrusive thoughts. And I'd be like, okay, well, how do you know that? Right? Well, I hear it. Okay, good. So you hear it. So you aren't the voice of the mind. You're the one who hears it, right? And this is this idea of witness consciousness, awareness consciousness, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't really matter. The point is to get the person to understand that there's actually space between having a thought and the experiencer. And this idea of subject-object awareness, meaning like if I hold this coffee mug up and I'm looking at the coffee mug and I notice and I'm aware of the coffee mug, I can't be the coffee mug itself, right? So the idea that I hear the mind is already evidence that I'm not the mind, right? Because of the subject object awareness space. Does that make sense to everyone? I just want to check in on that point, because this is the first thing that we need to be able to do is to create some space for the individual, because what's happening and what their experience is going to be is these thoughts are just going to be bombarding, just, what if, right? And generally, again, accompanying with a lot of anxiety. So the first thing we need to do in helping someone recover from this is this idea of consciousness and awareness, and helping that individual cultivate that space. So that's the idea of the voice in the mind and creating that subject object awareness first. And in the book Letting Go, Hawkins, or Dr. Hawkins, I should say, just fascinating book. And there's some other great books that I'll be happy to recommend. But one of the great topics on the subject object awareness would be Michael Singer in his book The Untethered Soul. Tolle talks about this. Eckhart Tolle does a really good job in his book, The Power of Now, like the first chapter, where he was talking about how, essentially he got to the point where his mind was saying, well, I don't want to live with myself. And then, his big realization was, well, like, who is I and who is myself, right? There must be like two things going on here, right? And that's this idea of like, I'm noticing the mind, right? And because if I, and this is often a question, going back to this real quick, if someone's wrestling with their thoughts, a lot of, like, one of the questions I might ask might be, okay, look, if I took a magic remote control and turned off your thoughts, like, would you stop existing? And the answer is always no, right? Like, most of us have had a time where our mind is calm and then our mind is turbulent. And that experience itself is an indicator, like, the mind is not you, right? You're just noticing the mind go very fast and say things that you don't really like right now. So this comes back down to the idea of like, okay, well, what creates thought? And, in the book, Letting Go, Hawkins says it's the accumulated pressure of feelings that actually causes thought. So one feeling, for instance, can literally produce thousands of thoughts over a period of time. Therefore, when we relinquish and let go of the feeling itself, we're freeing ourselves from all associated thought. And this is why working at this, I mean, it seems pretty obvious to work with an anxiety disorder from the place of anxiety, but it's not always that obvious to everyone, right? And that's why when we're talking about the feelings of fear that the person's experiencing underneath are generally the things that are actually causing the mind to go as turbulent as it is. Make sense? You guys with me on that? So one of the things that this is like an analogy you guys are welcome to use with people, but I always, with that subject object awareness, one of the analogies I always give to people is this idea of the fisherman. And what the mind is always trying to do is get the awareness involved and get the awareness in the conversation. And so I always equate it to like a fisherman, and the fisherman's going to try certain lures. And so if you're a fisherman and you're throwing a green lure out there and you're catching a fish every single time, well, are you going to keep using that lure? Right? And it's like, yeah, obviously. Right. And you can almost think of all the intrusive what if thoughts as different lures, right? And instead of the idea of like, okay, I only don't want to bite on a green lure, like, no, we don't want to bite on any, right? Which is oftentimes why we want to actually engage in some education and helping people understand the vast majority of all the different intrusive thoughts that can exist, because biting on the lure is essentially getting in the conversation and doing behaviors, right? So when we're able to give, like with most of my clients and people that come through my program, we talk about the fisherman all the time. Oh, what's the fisherman saying? Right? What's the lure the fisherman's trying, right? Because that is the intrusive thought. And we're the fish that's aware of the lure, right? And our goal is to not get caught in that loop. Okay. Making sense here with this particular analogy? Yeah. Okay, good. And so the take-home points that we want to talk about from this one point is, right, we're not working at it from a thought problem. It's not a thought problem. It doesn't matter what the thoughts are. It doesn't matter what the person's saying with their thoughts. And really getting them to understand that you're not your thoughts. You're the one who hears them, right? And the content of the fear does not matter. Like, that is a blanket statement, right? And then the metaphor that I want to offer in this particular one is the fisherman. Now, the next question, especially from like the clinicians and people working with people, is gonna be like, okay, well, Matt, when do the thoughts matter, right? And I would say that a good rule of thumb is basically the thoughts matter when the person doesn't think they matter, right? If that makes sense, right? So if the person's having what we might determine, like they wouldn't be calling them intrusive thoughts, right? Like no client is going to tell you they're having intrusive thoughts when the thoughts are what we would call egosyntonic, right? So the big differentiating point here with intrusive thoughts is this whole idea of a thought being ego dystonic versus egosyntonic, meaning if something is egosyntonic, sin to align, it means that the person recognizes that these thoughts are in alignment with what they want. Therefore, but when thoughts are egosyntonic, the person doesn't get disturbed by them. You know, when someone's really having homicidal thoughts that they want to act out on, they don't find them intrusive, right? They're like, yeah, I really want that, you know, and they're not going to be coming to you talking about intrusive thoughts. When thoughts are ego dystonic and against what the person wants and against who the person really is, right? That's when the thoughts are ego dystonic and they recognize them as intrusive, right? So it's really not going to be your job to identify if the thought's intrusive or not, because the person's usually going to be pretty clear about that, right? In these situations. And so I haven't had, you know, like that's always pretty obvious to the individual that's experiencing it. So shift number 2 is to stop trying to change your feelings, right? So we actually, you know, I know you're like, well, hey, Hawkins says that this is the thoughts come from feelings, so we need to work at the feelings. So this is when someone will go in and try to work at the loop from an anxiety perspective, right? And to understand anxiety, first, it's important to kind of understand the nervous system. And so for those of you familiar with polyvagal theory, the nervous system is really broken up into 2 parts, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And, you know, so the parasympathetic breaks up in the body to ventral vagal and dorsal vagal, right? So kind of up here and down here. The sympathetic tends to be right in the middle of the torso. And really the whole point of the nervous system is to keep you safe, right? When we feel safe, we want to socialize with people. We want to engage in relationship. And that's when we feel safe, it feels very easy to do that. When we feel in danger, we're going to feel more energy in the middle of the body, right? That's why most people with anxiety, they're going to report they feel it in their chest. And we can also be in yellow though and be safe. So we go into yellow when we, you know, do sports, when we are doing dancing, sex, art, right? Like we move into yellow in these states, but we're in a safe way. And then in red, this is when our body goes into full immobilization. This was when the person gets super depressed and just doesn't want to get out of bed. And then we'll also go into red in a safe way when we're sleeping, right? And meditation and stuff like that. So our body's shifting in and out of these states, but it's important to understand that from a nervous system standpoint, like the best way that I try to teach this to someone is just talking about an upside down stoplight. Right. So like we have this upside down stoplight in our system. And when we're in green, we're going to feel most of the energy directed into our face. So we are socializing. We feel it's okay, it's safe to smile. And then, you know, when we're in yellow, we're going to feel most of the energy right here in the middle of our chest. And when we're in red, we're going to feel most of it like deep in our tummy, our stomach. Right. And what our job is to actually from this perspective, our job is to get the person out of yellow and back into green. Right? Does that make sense? Like we want to help the person shift out of yellow and into green. And I find that a lot of my clients really like the stoplight analogy. Like at the end of the day, we don't want to use that much complicated language, right? We want to be able to explain things to people that they understand it. Right. So saying parasympathetic, sympathetic, that's good for textbooks, you know, great, you know, but like when we're talking about this with someone who's in the midst of chaos, let's talk about the stoplight, right? And when we understand psychological stress, and this is where some people might disagree with me here, and that's totally okay, but this is just how I work at it and how I teach it. When I look at yellow, right, you know, in the sympathetic nervous system, and especially with psychological stress, really what I talk about is this spectrum of an experience that we can have. And this spectrum, right, it goes all the way from feeling nervous before a date, all the way to panic attacks, derealization, and depersonalization on the other end. and then everything in the middle. And that can include social anxiety, phobias, right? It can include OCD and intrusive thoughts. And like I said, panic attacks and whatnot. And so when we understand this as an entire spectrum of an experience, we work at it from that level of like, there's just yellow, right? And yellow is going to produce fearful thoughts, right? So, and what we want to do is we're not trying to change the feeling itself in the body, right? Because that's not actually our job. Our job is if that feeling is already there, we actually want to work at it from that perspective. So teaching people that anxiety is a disorder is the problem, in my opinion, because at the end of the day, your nervous system, if it's falsely activating, what we want to do is teach the nervous system that we're safe, right? And this is why when we try to change anxiety, what most people do, and this is, I'm sure you guys see this left and right, is they shift into yellow and their thoughts start, correlating, right? So when they shift into yellow, their thoughts are going to produce more what if, danger, fear-based thoughts. Okay. So, and what happens is when you do something that tries to change the thought or change the feeling, it validates to your nervous system that you really were in danger. Does that make sense? And what our objective is, and that's why when we teach people, like, so if someone comes to you and says, I have anxiety, it shouldn't be like, oh my gosh, we need to change that. We need to get rid of it, right? Because anxiety is a normal human experience. How many of you on this call right now have had some kind of thought of what I've talked about or experienced yellow before in your life, right? You don't need to say, it's rhetorical. You don't need to self-disclose. It's fine. But my point is most of us, right? If not all of us, right? And the nervous system shifting in and out and having a false response to a threat is a normal experience. And anxiety itself is also a normal experience. And what we actually want to do is the problem actually comes when we pathologize anxiety, right? Because at the end of the day, the whole feeling spectrum that we have as humans are normal, right? And what our job is to get back to green. But if we're teaching people that anxiety is bad, they're going to try to get rid of it all the time, thereby, causing this loop, right? So the take-home point that we really want to work with someone is when they're feeling anxiety, it's like, oh, hey, this is your nervous system. And that's a normal experience, right? Like it might be activating when it's not supposed to. That's okay. We can work at that. But what we don't want to do is validate the idea that feeling anxiety is bad or an indication that the person has a disorder, quote unquote. Because what happens is then we work at it from medicating usually and escaping. So the person either has to stay really busy, they're going to take Xanax all the time, they're going to smoke weed all the time, they're going to drink alcohol because they believe the feeling itself is bad. So we don't want to work at the loop from an anxiety level because we don't want to validate the idea that anxiety is a bad feeling, right? So the main shift we need to make is really understanding that what our job is to break this loop itself. And the only logical way, the only way that we can ever really do that is by changing our behaviors, because we can't control our thoughts and we can't control our feelings, right? Like it's not something within our, you can't just tell someone like, hey, stop thinking that, or, hey, just feel happy, right? Like if that worked, we wouldn't need jobs, right? For most of us, right? If it was that easy, it was just like, oh, hey, feel happy. So when it comes to this, eliminating the safety behaviors, not the thoughts or feelings, is how you break the loop. And our goal is to break the loop. So these are some common safety behaviors that people aren't going to engage in, right? They're going to avoid triggers. They're going to avoid, triggering circumstances, places, people. They're going to get reassurance from people. They're going to get verbal reassurance. So this was a big thing that I did, was I would actually talk to my therapist, and my therapist would reassure me that I wasn't going to get possessed or something like that. And I would feel better. The problem is the therapist was acting as a safety behavior, right? Because they were reassuring me that my fear wasn't going to come true. So then you might go into checking locks, checking the stove, washing, cleaning, decontaminating, right? Controlling all this other stuff. So these are common physical safety behaviors. But here's where most people go wrong with OCD and anxiety, is that most safety behaviors happen right in someone's mind, right? And they don't even know it. And most clinicians and intervention people, don't know it either. So these are all the things that the person does in their mind, right? So if they analyze, if they ruminate, if they try to figure it out, if they are mentally reassuring themselves, mentally scanning and checking, body scanning, distracting, thought blocking, thought replacement, silent prayer, counting, repeating certain verses and phrases. This is all stuff that someone does right in their head. And, so I'm sure most of you are familiar with this idea of conditioning, but let's see how this all ties together. So Pavlov's dog, right? Dog salivates when it sees food. He starts ringing a bell. When he puts the food down, the dog starts salivating just when, just by the sound of the bell. Therefore, he's changing the physiological response of a dog through this behavioral intervention, right? So same thing here. And let's look at this process here. And this is kind of more of a traditional experience with OCD, but we'll kind of get the gist. So number one, the person has a what if thought, right? And about some kind of external experience, right? So in this case, what if this doorknob is contaminated with HIV, right? Now, so notice that we have an internal trigger and an external trigger. The person sees something out here, hears something, right? Has some kind of experience and has an internal thought about it that therefore activates the person's nervous system, which they perceive as anxiety. Now, in this situation, the anxiety goes up. So the person touches the doorknob, washes their hands, and the anxiety goes down. And so as people who like helping people feel better, we might be like, hey, well, just keep washing your hands, right? That makes sense. Yeah, just keep doing it, right? It makes you feel better. But the problem is what is this person's nervous system and brain being conditioned to learn in this scenario, right? Two things. Number one is that soap keeps me safe, right? That soap actually kept me safe. Number two, doorknobs are actually dangerous because I had this internal shift from fear to not and through that, it thereby validated the threat. Make sense? So with that, when we have an intrusive thought or a what if thought or a fear-based thought, right? Understanding that generally what most people are going to report in almost every case I've ever worked is usually intrusive thoughts tend to onset at very stressful points of their life, right? In almost every case I've ever seen, especially that was my case. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily connect these two things, but usually in heavy transition periods, like starting college, right? Breakups, losing a job, all this stuff, stress is already in the body. And that pressure from the actual emotion of fear, right? And stress and all that tends to produce the intrusive thoughts, right? And those intrusive thoughts that thereby create more anxiety. And then the person engages in a safety behavior, like mentally ruminating, analyzing all this other stuff. And they get a short-term relief from it, but that validates that the thought was actually dangerous. So the mind produces it more, and this cycle just forms. And this can happen with anything. I've seen it happen with any theme you can imagine. So to pause real quick, I just want to make sure that this concept makes sense, because what we need to be really clear about is that these safety behaviors that we're looking to get rid of can be physical and mental. And they're going to be probably 80 to 90% mental. And what most people don't realize is that, don't worry about it, I won't go back. What most people don't realize is that they're engaging in mental safety behaviors without even realizing it. Okay. So our job is not, hey, what is the intrusive thought you're having? It's, hey, what are the behaviors you're doing that are keeping this wheel going, that's continuing to activate your nervous system? Right. So this is where the whole idea of, I'm sure some of you guys have heard of, exposure and response prevention comes into play, which is really kind of one of the cornerstones of most anxiety and OCD treatment. And again, it works for the whole spectrum of anxiety, right? The issue is that a lot of people will say, well, I've tried it, it doesn't work for me. I hear that every single day of the week from some email that I get, right? And what most people don't realize is they're not doing it correctly. And so when you're talking about the OCD and anxiety cycle, here's the general experience of what's going to happen. The person's going to get so the bar on the left was never good at statistics and graphs. So just the bar on the left is anxiety, right? The one on the bottom is time. So the anxiety or the sympathetic nervous system is going to shoot up, right? And the little dot up here represents a compulsion that someone engages in. And what happens is it's going to immediately bring the anxiety down. Okay, so compulsions are going to work for the individual. Okay, I want to be very clear about that. Washing their hands or ruminating or getting that reassurance from you is like a drug. Okay, so if you're reassuring someone, you're literally like giving them that drug, and it's going to make them feel better. Okay, because they wouldn't do it if it didn't work. So the problem is like I said, it validates the threat. So what happens is the next time they experience that trigger, the anxiety goes higher. And then they have to do more compulsions to get the same level of relief, right? And what happens, generally speaking, is that what you're going to see with someone is the intrusive thoughts and the triggers are going to get worse over time, and they're going to have to engage in more compulsions to get the same relief. And because they're going to build tolerance to the compulsions. So what used to be a quick hand wash, I've seen it turn into literally someone taking 6-hour showers a day, right? Like when this loop is really going, I've watched this spin out in all sorts of ways, for people. But the point is that over time, while they have these quick drops of anxiety, they're going to get worse over time. And what our objective needs to be is not help them today, but help them for the rest of their life. And that's why we need to look at it from a loop perspective. Now, when we're doing exposure response prevention, you're going to see, so we're going to have this trigger happen, right? And what we're going to do is prevent. So what is exposure response prevention? Expose the person to the perceived threat and then prevent the response, meaning prevent the compulsion. What it should be called is exposure compulsion prevention. Right. And we're preventing the response. So we're not engaging in any behaviors. And what happens is that, as you can see, there's a big old gap here. And what our nervous system is capable of doing is actually regulating on its own. Right. So what happens is it takes more time. Like the person is going to get super anxious, and by not doing anything to calm the anxiety down, the anxiety regulates over time through this phenomenon of habituation, it's called. And then what happens though next is that the next time they experience that trigger, because they didn't do anything to keep themselves safe and their nervous system regulated, their brain's learning, oh, well, that might not have actually been dangerous, right? So then they do the behavior again, and the nervous system doesn't trigger as high. And then we let the same process happen of the anxiety going down on its own. And then we keep doing that and keep doing that and keep doing that and keep doing that, essentially to allow the nervous system to learn that it's already safe, that this is not dangerous, right? That's the entire philosophy of exposure response prevention. And so when we're talking about the loop, I'm hoping you guys are seeing this, that if the person has an intrusive thought and it triggers the anxiety, what our job is to remove all compulsions to not validate that thought is really dangerous. Because if we do, they're just going to, again, keep going in this up and down loop, right? Where with exposure response prevention, we're going to actually have them be a little more uncomfortable for a short period of time, because we know over the long run, we can turn that fear into something that doesn't activate their nervous system. Now, most of you guys can attest to this. How many of you guys have been afraid of something in the past that you're no longer afraid of? Right. Yeah, so all of us, right? Because how does that happen? By facing the fear itself. What does that mean? It means exposing ourselves to the fear and then not doing anything that actually is validating it, right? And allowing the energy to surface in the body and actually release on its own accord, right? And then once our nervous system learns that something isn't dangerous, it stops going into the fight or flight. That is the most effective way. And then this is probably the best news and something that really is helpful to clients when you talk about this, is this idea of neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity, essentially is rooted in this idea of Hebb's law and the quantum Zeno effect. And it doesn't matter what those things are, right? All that matters is that this idea of the hiking trail, right? And the hiking trail is like, so how many of you guys have been on a hike before, right? And most of the time when we go on a hike, it's nice to hike trails that are already there, right? So as you can see, these people walking on this trail. And so Hebb's law is this idea that neurons in the brain that fire together wire together. Okay, so think of each of these little dots like little neurons. And what happens is as the person is, so think about it from an OCD perspective. The person has an intrusive thought, the sympathetic nervous system activates, they feel anxiety, they do a compulsion and they get relief. Well, those neurons all fire together, right? So the next time the person has those, so it forms like a circuit in the brain, right? So the next time that person experiences an intrusive thought, well, yeah, the nervous system's going to fire off. And what do you think their brain's going to tell them to do? Do the same safety behavior, because that got us relief last time. The issue is that continuing to walk on this trail again and again is going to lead to this OCD and anxiety loop, which is going to lead to a very limited and disordered life. So when we're rewiring the brain, we got to think about it like, hey, dude, we've been trying this compulsion thing for however long, and it's not getting us anywhere. So what this process is saying like, okay, let's pretend we're here on the trail. Like I see that little patch over there. I'm going to walk to that patch. And then I'm going to walk to this patch and this patch and this patch and this patch. And what's going to happen is if I keep walking that, I'm going to forge a new trail, right? And what's going to happen is if I don't walk the other one, it's going to grow over. And eventually, if I keep walking this new path of exposure response prevention, that eventually the old trail will heal, right? And I won't be getting activated and I won't be going to or feeling compelled to do these safety behaviors. So the take-home points is safety behaviors keep you in yellow, right? So you gotta think of it just purely from an energetic perspective. Is the sympathetic, the nervous system, when we engage in fight or flight, it takes glucose and turns it into energy to fight or flight a threat, right? The problem with anxiety, like we said, was that there's no threat happening. So all that energy is experienced in the body and it's very uncomfortable. So when that energy creates more thoughts and then we engage in safety behaviors, it creates this literal like energetic loop that is just self-perpetuating. So what our job is when we cut out the behaviors, it essentially short circuits the loop and that energy stays up in the body and then releases, and then the nervous system regulates. That's the objective right there, is to get the nervous system back into safety. And the way we do that is by not engaging in any behaviors that are validating the threat. And in order to do this, though, you must eliminate all behaviors. This is another huge point where people go wrong. They're like, oh, I've been trying ERP with the person and I've been having him touch the doorknobs and he's not getting better, right? Or they're not getting better. And so they touch the doorknobs. And what the person doesn't realize is that the person's just going and ruminating or mentally reassuring or thought blocking and doing all these mental behaviors. So they're not even engaging in true exposure response prevention. They're just engaging in an exposure and doing a completely different compulsion, right? This is the number one problem people run into with ERP is they're engaging in mental behaviors and they don't realize it, especially, and this is especially true with intrusive thoughts. With the intrusive thoughts, people are engaging in all sorts of mental behaviors and they don't even know it. And so our objective is to identify, or help them identify, should I say, what behaviors they're engaging in that are feeding this loop, and then remove them, right? Now, this is where, like, a lot of the work that I do and a lot of work that I try to bring to the field is trying to do that part effectively, right? Because telling someone not to ruminate is not that effective, right? Telling someone not to engage in an unhealthy behavior is not, if that worked, right? People that wrestle with alcoholism, I would just tell them not to drink, right? I would just, I have an idea, stop drinking, right? We know that doesn't work, right? So telling someone to not engage in safety behaviors, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. They're going to be like, well, guess what? I'm not doing that, right? Because this is the only thing that makes me feel better. So the AAA response is a process and methodology that I coined and kind of use with all my clients. And, so it's our kind of process that we teach. And really the whole concept of it is to move the person to a solution that indirectly eliminates all the unhealthy behaviors so that they focus on what to do as opposed to what not to do. So in paralleling the alcohol example, it wouldn't be, hey, don't drink, but we would set up a plan. When you go out to a restaurant, you're allowed to have coffee, a cranberry juice, or an iced tea, right? You're allowed to, those are your three solutions. Now, and it doesn't necessarily work this way with the AAA response, but the concept is the same. We want to move them to what to focus on instead of having them continuing to focus on the problem. So and really put the energy on what to do. So the basic, and I can't get into this today, but I'll show you a way you can get access to more in-depth on this for free. Because this training is more about understanding the problem as a whole. But the basic idea is we have 3 steps, right? And it's agree and disengage the mind, allow the feelings that are happening in the body, and attack by actually moving in opposition to what the fear is telling you to do. And the principle is very simple, right? Fear is always going to tell you to do a compulsion. So when you do the opposite of what it's saying, you can't do a compulsion. So when it's saying, hey, you should go wash your hands, you do the opposite. When it's saying, definitely take the stairs because the elevator is dangerous, you go take the elevator. And by constantly doing this, what we're doing is engaging in ERP essentially 24 hours a day. So it's breaking the loop, and it's very effective in helping people make really significant strides in a short period of time. So the idea is really simple, is like we look at it like a math equation, right? Like the only way the person can have that OCD and anxiety loop is if they have those 4 components. If the intrusive thoughts are there, or the obsessive thoughts, the anxiety, the safety behavior or compulsion, and the relief, right? If those 4 things exist, that loop is going to form, and it can form about anything, right? From finances to the relationship, to intrusive thoughts, to fears of driving, to fears of flying, to germs, whatever you can imagine, it can form on. So the idea is, if we look at it from a math equation, like if the person doesn't do compulsions, they cannot have this loop, right? And this is why I've seen people go from scoring on the Y box, in the 30, 35, 36 range, which is extreme situations, to testing to the point where they're subclinical, meaning they can't have a diagnosis of OCD. So when people tell me this idea of like, well, this isn't treatable or anything like that, it's like, well, no, it's like when we understand it from a nervous system perspective, and we really do remove all compulsions, this wheel can't exist. So this is why, like, when you have the obsession plus anxiety, if you remove the safety behavior, right, by doing the AAA response, and we do it every single time, that's how someone breaks free from this loop. And so that's what the F stands for. So, see, I should have hit the next button because now you would have seen it. And so, so to recap the presentation is, the shifts we need to make when we're working from this is to stop trying to change the person's thoughts, stop trying to change the feelings and not work at it from that level, really work at it from a behavioral model and remove all of the safety behaviors, mental and physical. And the best way I know to do that is to help implementing a solution-focused approach, right? And shifting them on what to do every time, as opposed to trying to remove what not to do. So free gift for attending today, or if you're watching the replay, I have a copy of my book. It's yours free. All you need to do is I have both the digital and audio book. It's called From Stuck to Unstuck. This will help you understand the AAA response more and go more in depth into that. And if you use the promo code COC for Connect OC, you'll get it. You'll just be able to get it for free. And so you'll still have to enter in your email, and you'll get access to everything like that. So I wanted to give that to everyone, just to help kind of dive deeper into what we talked about today. So with that said, I know I didn't, I try to get it, have some space for questions, but I want to make sure that we can take some questions, at least for a little bit. Is that cool, guys?
Yeah, we've got time.
Cool.
If you all have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or feel free to hit the raise hand button on reactions down below at the control bar, or honestly, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, I want to just start by saying, did that help conceptualize this idea? I want to make sure you guys feel like you took something away that you're going to be able to use, or that you're able to give to someone. Okay, cool. Because I think understanding it from these perspectives, this is what's, what I've seen help produce the best results for people that are experiencing it. And that's why our instinct is always going to be to talk about the thoughts they're having, to try to make them not feel anxiety, anything like that. And if you want, and I understand that questions could be kind of personal. So if you want to just message me a question, I'll read it anonymously, and just kind of, because I'm sure your question is someone else's question. So, anyone have anything they want to ask? Well, okay. I know.
Matt, you nailed it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I want to make sure that this was helpful for you guys. And so anyone have clients that wrestle with this? And you can ask questions about clients you're working with or things like that.
Hi, this is Nasli Restrepo.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. I really appreciate the information you shared to me. We work at a local nonprofit where we're offering a lot of mental health aid. And so I resonated a lot with the population that we serve, which is primarily Latino families, first gen, as well as immigrant families. And then personally, as myself, as a person of color, I see a lot of anxiety coming from systems, fear of the system, fear, and some of it racially based, right? So when we're talking about cultural competency and how do we incorporate that in some of these diagnoses and address those areas, because some of those fears do derive from real concepts of fear of the system. So I'm just curious about how cultural nuances are addressed when we deal with anxiety and OCD.
I mean, it's I guess you would just work on a case by case basis. I don't, because again, the issue is that if we focus on control, like, things outside of our control, it's going to make people feel powerless, right? And really emphasize the idea of victimhood, right? So like when, regardless, like what my objective is always with anyone is whatever their fear is. I don't tend to validate fear a lot, right? I mean, because it's again, and fear is based on perception, and perception is based on beliefs, right? And so if we are validating beliefs that are not empowering to the individual, they're going to ultimately kind of stay in a disempowered state, right? So, what I work at is very much the idea of like, okay, like what are the fears you have, right? And then we work at it from like what's going on in the person's internal experience. And because at the end of the day, it's very possible for that person to get their nervous system to the place where they feel safe. When a person feels safe, right, and they're really in like a state of green is the dominant state they're in, a lot of what we perceive as problems we're able to see in a totally different light, and more importantly, work from a very much higher perspective, right? And us being able to work at the problems that we're facing in life from like the highest consciousness possible and the highest state we can is always going to produce the best results. So I don't tend to, that's not a primary focus, because I mean, I have people from every background and, situation you can imagine, right? Like, and it doesn't, I don't tend to make it the focus. The focus is always like, how can I get this person to the most optimal state and where they're in like a thriving state, right? And I look at it just from like an individual perspective. So because when it comes to anxiety, if again, it's a false danger, right? Like, and that's where the questions always come in. Like, is this a current threat that you're experiencing? Right? No, it's in your mind. Okay, now we know that it's anxiety, right? And to be kind of how I look at it, like, because I always ask the question, and this is what's always so interesting to me about running like anxiety groups and OCD groups, is everyone in the group will usually, like, you'll be able to look at everyone else in the group and be like, that makes no sense to worry about that, right? Like that, like, for most people, like someone who has a fear of contamination and someone who has an intrusive thought, they'll look at each other and be like, this makes no sense for you to spend your whole day worrying about this and feeling anxious. And that's what, and they both think that about each other. But when they talk about their own fears, they feel that my fear is valid. So a lot of times what our work is actually devalidating fears, right? Because I've sat and pondered this idea, is there such thing as a useful fear in life, right? Because I've worked with people with so many different fears about like any topics you can really imagine, all the way from like, and obviously now we're getting, more and more like people that develop OCD just based on the experience with COVID, right? And just seeing what the fear did to that person and the long-term effects of that, right? And then which leads one to question, like, and when we're talking about the fear of disease, health anxiety, right, all that stuff, I mean, there's, like I generally just tend to focus on it from the individual's perspective, and my goal is to always help the individual get their nervous system to the place where they're feeling really safe and going into their life with that mentality. So I don't know that answers your question very well, to be honest, but it's like I always look at it just from the individual's perspective. And a lot of it comes back down to challenging and restructuring beliefs that are going to serve them for the long term of their life, and whatever that is. Right. And so if they're believing something that is, and they're having a story that's causing them to really activate their nervous system and anxiety, a lot of times it's looking at that underlying story and belief structure and helping them create beliefs that are going to serve them better. Is how I guess I would work at that. So here's a private question. Okay, let me read it. I'm sorry, it's a little bit long. And if you have any other private questions, you're welcome to send it to me. Okay, so hello, I have a question. I don't want to diagnose, but my boyfriend's roommate has many of the symptoms of OCD. Yeah, most of us know, can immediately think of people in our lives, right? So everything you explained in the presentation, he does, especially with the constant cleaning, checking, locks multiple times, showering twice a day, etc. We try to be understanding and want some advice of people who live and loved ones that have OCD, right? So that's a really good question. So I have a whole training just on that, actually, because he focuses a lot on religion rather than going to therapy, right? And it's made it really hard to live with him. Yeah, so this is really good. When it comes to helping a loved one with OCD and anxiety, the thing we need to do is actually remove any accommodation, right? So like I've had many times where I can think of several cases. I remember one time worked with a family, and the young woman that was experiencing this was like, she just controlled the whole house, right? Like no one could eat in the kitchen when she was eating, right? Like she had to text her mom. Her mom actually quit her job to accommodate all her behaviors because the girl had to text her mom over 100 times a day, and the mom had to reassure her over 100 times. And so when it's what our job, again, and this is where it comes back down to this, the person is always the person who's gonna, the person suffering is the person who's going to get themselves better, right? Like we never get someone better. We never save someone or heal someone, right? Our job is to empower the individual to heal themselves, right? And what a lot of accommodation behavior does is it kind of validates that how they're living is okay, right? And so what by removing the accommodating behaviors, what it does is it forces the person to kind of confront the the reality of the situation, right? So it's not uncommon where I'm saying, to parents, and I know this sounds intense because like I've seen it where parents just like 36-year-old, person is living with their parents, and the parents just doing everything for the individual, and the person just compulses all day. Well, that's not a good quality of life for the parent, and actually it's hurting the person in the long run. So in some situations, it's appropriate to kind of really force the person into a situation where they're forced to confront this idea that they're not behaving in healthy ways, right? And there's obviously an art to doing that and doing that well, but it's a thing where it's not ever our job to suffer so that someone else like doesn't feel uncomfortable, right? Like, and this is where I'm very much of the opinion that our feelings are our own responsibility, and it's not our job to make sure to prioritize other people's feelings. It's not that we need to be disrespectful or hurt other people, but our job is to really make sure we are focusing on this. And if we all do that in a healthy way, I think it would be a lot better, because right now what's happening in this situation is you're prioritizing this person's feelings over yourself. And what that's generally going to lead to is resentment. And it's going to put a super big strain on the relationship. right? And so if I was in this specific situation, I would have to have a serious conversation with the person, be like, look, I really think like we can't do any accommodations anymore. Right. Like from our end, if the person wants to continue compulsing and do that, that's fine. Ultimately it's their decision to get help or not, but you have to remove yourself out of the accommodations. Like you can't. And so when someone asks me for reassurance in a loving, caring way, it's very much like, hey man, I think that this is a reassurance question and I really want you to get better from OCD and anxiety. And so I'm not going to answer that. Like that's generally how I'll say something, when someone is asking me for reassurance, even as a client, it's very much like, I just call it what it is. I say, oh, I think that's a reassurance question. And if I answer that, it's just going to feed the loop and it's actually not going to help you. Right. So you don't need to play therapist and it's not your job to do the intervention, but it is a thing where if we remove our accommodations, usually things get a little worse and the person will hopefully wake up to the idea of like, hey, maybe I need to address this. That's what I would say. Any other questions I can help with? Yeah, no problem. Hope that was helpful. And I think, again, in the book too, it's like I have a whole list of like safety behaviors. And sometimes it's like, hey, look, like, giving the person a book, right? Like, hey, I was learning about this. I think it will help you, right? Not like you have a problem, you need to fix it, but in like, hey, look, I think this is really impacting how you're living, dude. And I want the best for you, is what I would say. Right. And so it's like, I would be presenting resources from the level of like, hey, I really want you to get better. Because this seems like it's really taking a lot, like, because even when you are diagnosing OCD with the Y box or whatever, what you're really calculating is how much time does this consume in a person's life, right? By engaging in all these compulsions. And that's why, a lot of times when someone's filling out the assessment or applying for the program, that's one of the first things we have them do, because that awareness of like, dude, like I spend 3 hours a day doing compulsions is a kind of a, like they usually don't think it's that much. They're not usually aware of how much it's impacting. And so that's why it's important. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions I can help with? I think we're good. Cool.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
To have you. I found that
Thanks for having me.
helpful, really clarifying for me. I think that everything was broken down really well. I got me thinking a little bit about Naslie's question earlier too, and I maybe have some clarification with you, Matt, that that when we're talking about in this context, you mentioned we're talking about the fears. We're talking about fears that are centered on the past or on a possible future, right?
Right.
So we're talking about something that may well be rooted in a theoretical world, an actual possible threat, but it's a bit outsized and it's kind of hypothesized, right? So like maybe to Naslie's question, someone whose family has negative experiences with the immigration system, there might be, say, a young person in that family who is afraid that maybe their parents who might be undocumented, maybe something happened to them. So they're texting them multiple times a day. Hey, are you okay? Hey, are you okay? And there's it's not to say that it's not, for example, rooted in a hypothetical world and a real possible threat, but it's this future-centered threat that is becoming not only outsized in the place it's occupying in our mind and the reaction in our nervous system, but then the actions that we're taking, the safety behaviors that we're taking to gain some level of regulation, if temporary, for the nervous system. Does that seem right to say? So what we're doing there is we're intervening on the behavior because that is the place where most
the person, this is the thing where it's about developing awareness, right? The person may perceive, so this is where it's like, okay, all fear is hypothetical, right? What's the difference in that and fearing, what if I get in a car accident on the ride home today? Mm-hmm. Right? Which fear is more valid? This would be the question. And to say more valid, what is worth using this time that we have right now to try to control a future outcome that we don't want?
Right.
right? That's all this really is. And to say that one fear is more valid than the other, and that's what I was trying to stress, is I don't know that that's true, right? Because because if we're validating that, then we're going to validate the idea of doing something and engaging in compulsions right now, right? Because the mind itself, if we really are thinking, if we're really honest about it, can only exist by going into the past or future. We don't worry about things that are happening right now. In fact, our system's actually very good at handling things that are happening right now, because there's always immense clarity on the best route to take right now when it's happening, right? What we don't want to do is get in the idea of trying to predict threats and resolve those, because at the end of the day, there's no way our mind could come up with all things that could happen and protect us from all of those. Right. Like that's, and so what in this situation, even taking a past bad experience and projecting it into the future, right, is actually not, necessarily a good thing to do, because you're still taking the past and your experience from the past and projecting it into the future, thereby not living right now. Right. So the healthier thing to do is to learn more and more and more how to be more present and not in the mind. Right. Like that's what the real root of suffering is, just being in your mind. Right. Because at the end of the day, if we go back through our lives, we've always been able to handle everything that's happened. Right. What becomes unmanageable is trying to handle something that hasn't happened and may never happen. And the question we need to ask ourselves too with anxiety is, how many times have I worried about something and then it never happened? Therefore, I suffered for no reason at all. Right. And that's 99% of the time. So when we're talking about eliminating people's suffering, it really is understanding this idea that probably 99% of people's suffering is actually just in the mind. And by teaching people how to be more engaged in the present and trusting the present, right? Because if you're really present, you can't be in the mind. Those things can't exist simultaneously. You can't worry about what's happening right now, because no matter what you're worrying about, it's based on information that was received even seconds ago. So to experience life from a place of presence is going to, really, that's the way that the nervous system can operate as it's really supposed to, right? The psychological stress is the problem, in my opinion, right?
That makes a lot of sense. I think for me, the past and future context was important. That what we're talking about here is not, for example, there's a distinction between somebody who is imagining the possibility, who's reluctant to go on a hike because they're imagining the possibility they might encounter a bear, and they're not sure what would happen. What would I do if I encountered a bear? What if I got mauled? And what if, versus somebody who's standing in front of a bear, right? That is clearly exhibiting threatening behavior. That's a present reality that you then need to respond to, versus a hypothetical reality that you can never sufficiently respond to because.
Well, and to go off that example, right? It's a great example, because it's the same thing as when you go into the sympathetic nervous system. The problem is that your nervous system is naturally going to be hyper aware to threat when you're in the sympathetic. So if we're in the sympathetic state all the time, we're going to see threat everywhere. It's not that threat is actually everywhere. That's what we're perceiving based on our state of consciousness. Okay. And this is why, I encourage everyone just not to listen to the news and stuff, right? Because the news in a lot of ways, I mean, if you just go and watch the news objectively, instead of actually trying to gain information, you'll see that the headlines are generally written in a way to stimulate fear. One of the reasons that is because when you're afraid, you're in that state. So you're going to maintain awareness in a protective state unconsciously, right? So what our job, and this is why it's always being aware of our level of consciousness. This is what I mean when I say, if everyone had the really focused on the work of raising one's consciousness, and because if at the end of the day, a lot of times most conflict happens completely out of misperception, right? Completely out of misperception and miscommunication. That's probably 90% of conflict. And I think most of us can agree with that. Anyone that's married knows that that's usually what's going on. Is you're having a bad day. You say something that wasn't really meant, or interpreted a wrong way. You interpret a comment a certain way, and it creates more conflict. When we work on regulating our own nervous system and getting ourselves into the highest state, we're always going to bring that state into whatever we're dealing with, right? So at the end of the day, what we come to what we come to just logically understand is that we're never going to be able to predict what life's going to throw at us. It's just going to throw stuff at us, right? Like things are just going to happen, and by being present and not being in our mind, we're actually going to be able to handle it much better. And being able to trust that, what happens is we can let go of having to be in the mind to trying to protect ourselves from all these potential threats. Right. And that's really the deeper philosophy of the treatment and recovery process is we want to move the person from a state of fear into a state of trust as much as possible. And really adopt and reinforce belief structures that are going to validate the idea that the person can be trusting. Right. And I think part of the general narrative out there that a lot of people believe is they don't believe that they're safe. I mean, it's so interesting, but it's like, I mean, when you watch the news and you walk outside, you're going to get two different full experiences. Right. And this is why what you're consuming is important, because it's going to alter your belief structures and your perception. Right. And what our job is to create beliefs that are going to serve the person well. And actually being in a state of stress, as we all know, is going to lead to, the immune system being, compromised and all of that. So being in a state of the parasympathetic is going to help our overall well-being, our relationships, our health, all of that, right? And this is why when we realize that most of our stress we experience is purely because what our mind is saying. And at the end of the day, like most of us aren't encountering like life-threatening events on a second-by-second basis, right? As we just go about our day, right? That said, we live in a state like that's actually happening because whatever our mind's saying is just producing that stress response again and again, and we're in that state. The stress response is designed as a very temporary survival mechanism, right? But it's become a thing where it's become a source of a problem with this psychological stress phenomenon. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I think that was really helpful for me, at least. And now I want to take some time quick to just shift a couple things. One, Crystal has posted in the chat a link to our survey. We want to invite you all to fill that out as you're able. It's helpful to us. It's helpful to continue to help us think about how we meaningfully engage and produce content that will be useful for you all in the community at large. And want to then shift as well to pass off to Sarah on our team and see if there is, forgive me, Tim, I'm trying to recall if there's anything we want to update everybody on Connective C, and then we'll take some time to give you all space to update anything that's going on with you, with your organizations.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, just a few updates on our end. We do have a special something that we have prepared that we're going to be posting in September for Suicide Awareness Month. We have actually teamed up with Tilly's Life Center and filmed a really awesome PSA that will be out very soon. It's so good. We saw it this week, just all put together, and we're making final edits, and we're hoping to promote that throughout this year. So we're really excited for that. We also have a few resource fairs that we're planning right now. So if you are interested in being a part of one of those, feel free to reach out to us and we can maybe connect you with one of those spots as well. Those are just a couple of our updates that we do have. So I'm going to actually open it up to our partners and see if anybody else has any updates that they'd like to share with the rest of the group. If you are willing, you can either unmute yourself or just raise your hand. Last call. Going once, going twice. Sweet. All right. Well, yeah. Thank you so much, Matt. Like that was so good. I was literally like like my head was just bobbing the whole time. I was like, yep, that resonates. So it was super good. So I really appreciate your time and everything that you have done to put this all together for us. As always, Crystal has put the survey link in the chat if you need it. If you have a couple of minutes for us, please complete our survey. We really need your feedback so we can make our events and our coalition meetings better and tailored to what the people want as well. And with that, I will say have a great weekend, everyone. Stay safe, stay cool, and we'll see you all next month.
Bye, everyone. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.